There are two tragedies hiding inside this story, not one. Everyone knows the boy who fell in love with his own reflection. Almost nobody remembers the nymph whose voice was the only thing left of her by the time his story even begins. Two people, cursed in completely different ways, crossing paths for a single afternoon that neither of them ever recovered from. This is the story of Echo and Narcissus. If you enjoy stories like this one, just like Sylvia does. Hi Sylvia! Consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so the next one finds you the moment it's ready. High up on Mount Cithaeron, the wind never really stops moving. It comes down through the pines, cuts across open grass, carries the smell of dry earth and wild thyme all the way up to where the mountain nymphs made their home. That's where Echo lived. She was an Oread, one of the mountain nymphs, and she ran with Artemis and her hunting party. Not just ran with them either, she was the heart of the group, the one who kept everyone laughing on the long walk back after a hunt. The one who could take a single ordinary afternoon and turn it into a story worth hearing twice. People sought her out, that's the simplest way to put it. Give Echo the smallest scrap of news and she'd hand it back to you shaped into something worth telling. Ask her a question, and she'd already have 3 different answers ready before you finished asking. Nobody on that mountain talked quite like she did. Artemis noticed it too in her own way. The goddess wasn't much for chatter herself. She was all business on a hunt, all silence and focus. But she kept Echo close anyway, the way you keep someone around who makes the long walks feel shorter. If a hunt ran late and the whole party trudged home exhausted in the dark, it was Echo's voice that carried them the rest of the way, turning a bad day into a story they'd all still be laughing about a week later. Zeus noticed her too. Not for her friendship, for her usefulness. He was always slipping away from Olympus, chasing after one nymph or another across the mountainsides, and Hera had a habit of following close behind, sharp-eyed and suspicious. So Zeus made an arrangement with Echo. Whenever Hera came looking, Echo would catch her on the path, keep her talking, draw her into one story, then another, long enough for Zeus to disappear before his wife ever caught him. It worked. For a long time, it worked beautifully. Hera genuinely liked Echo's company. She never once suspected she was being managed instead of entertained. But queens figure things out eventually. Hera caught Zeus slipping away one time too many, Echo still mid-sentence beside her, and when she understood what had actually been happening, her fury came fast and total. She couldn't punish Zeus. She never really could, so all of it landed on Echo instead. The curse was simple and it was merciless. Echo would never speak a word of her own again. Not a greeting, not a question. Nothing that started as an idea in her own head. All she'd ever be allowed to do from that moment forward was repeat back whatever someone else had just said to her. The last few words, and nothing more. The most talkative nymph on the entire mountain. And now she had nothing left to say that was actually hers. Down in the valley below, a very different story was already taking shape. Narcissus was born to Cephissus, a river god whose waters ran cold and clear through the valley he ruled, and Liriope, a nymph known for a beauty that turned heads wherever she walked. The moment her son was born, Liriope wanted to know his future, so she carried him to Tiresias, a blind seer whose predictions never once turned out wrong, no matter how strange they sounded when he first said them. Tiresias hadn't always been blind, and his story is its own strange one. Years before, walking through the forest, he'd come across two snakes mating and struck them apart with his staff, an act that transformed him without warning into a woman. He lived that way for 7 full years, until he happened across the same two snakes a second time and struck them again, and found himself changed back. It was that rare experience, having lived life as both a man and a woman, that led Zeus and Hera to call on him later to settle an argument neither of them could agree on. Tiresias gave his honest answer, and it wasn't the one Hera wanted to hear. Her fury cost him his sight in an instant. Zeus, unable to undo what his own wife had done, gave him something in exchange. The gift of true prophecy, sharp and unfailing, to make up for the light he'd never see again. "Will my son live to see old age?" Liriope asked him. Tiresias thought about it a long moment. "Yes," he finally said. "If he never comes to know himself." Nobody understood that answer. Not Liriope, who carried the words around for years without cracking their meaning. Not the household that raised him. Certainly not Narcissus himself, who grew from a striking child into a young man so beautiful that people started travelling real distances just to see him. Hunters crossed an extra ridge on the chance of catching him in the distance. Young women invented errands that happened to take them past wherever he liked to walk, and with all that beauty came something cold. Narcissus turned every one of them away. Nymphs loved him. Young men loved him. They brought him flowers, sang to him, followed him through the forest, hoping for even a moment of his attention. None of it ever worked. He rejected each one the same way. He's not cruel exactly, not in any single moment, just unmoved, untouched, as if admiration were a language he'd simply never bothered to learn. It's worth pausing on that for a second, because it's easy to imagine Narcissus as simply arrogant and leave it there, but arrogance usually knows it's being cruel. What made Narcissus different was that he didn't seem to notice the effect he had on people at all. He wasn't cruel on purpose. He was just entirely, completely unaware that anyone else's feelings were something he needed to account for. One of those he turned away was a young man named Ameinius, and his story matters, because it's the one that finally set everything else in motion. Ameinius loved Narcissus with the kind of devotion that doesn't know how to go quiet. He pursued him for months. Gifts, letters, every gesture he could think of. Narcissus grew tired of it, and cruelly so. He sent Ameinius a sword, a mocking gift, dressed up as kindness, and told him that if he loved so hopelessly, perhaps he should simply put an end to the feeling. Ameinius took the sword to Narcissus's own doorstep, and there in front of the house of the one person who'd never once looked at him the way he'd hoped, he ended his own life. His last words weren't anger. They were a prayer. He asked the gods for exactly one thing: that Narcissus someday might understand what it felt like to love someone completely and never once have it returned. That kind of prayer doesn't just fade into silence. This one reached exactly where it needed to. Around this same time, cursed and voiceless, Echo wandered too far from Artemis's hunting party one afternoon. She ended up deep in Narcissus's forest, further than she'd meant to go. And there he was, walking alone between the trees, sunlight catching him at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right one, depending on how you look at it. Echo fell for him instantly, completely, the way you'd expect from someone who used to be the most expressive nymph on the whole mountain, now reduced to feeling everything and saying none of it. She followed him for days, close enough to watch, never close enough to speak first. The words piled up uselessly in her throat every single time she tried. Her chance finally came when Narcissus, separated from his own hunting companions, called out into the trees. "Is anyone here?" "Here," Echo answered immediately. It was the last word he'd said, and her curse allowed her exactly that much and nothing more. Startled, Narcissus turned toward the sound. "Come to me," he called. "Come to me," Echo repeated. And this time she didn't just answer. She stepped out from the trees and ran toward him. Finally, after days of silent watching, close enough to actually reach him. Narcissus recoiled the moment she touched his arm. His face twisted closer to disgust than surprise. "Hands off. I would rather die than have you touch me." He walked away without a second glance, exactly the way he'd walked away from every admirer before her. Echo stood alone in the clearing, holding nothing, having said nothing that was ever truly hers to say. Her grief matched everything else about total, complete, nothing held back. She fled deep into the mountains, away from Artemis's hunting party, away from anywhere Narcissus might ever pass again. She simply stopped living the way she used to, stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Month after month, her body wasted away, grief working on what the curse had already left hollow, until eventually there was nothing physical left of her at all. Only her voice remained, scattered now across every canyon and cliff face she'd ever wandered through, still bound by the same cruel condition Hera had placed on her, able only to repeat back whatever words happened to reach her, and nothing more. Ameinius's dying prayer reached Nemesis, goddess of retribution, and it landed on ground that had already been prepared. Echo's grief. The grief of every other admirer Narcissus had ever turned away without a second thought. It had all been building toward this for a long time, and Nemesis had been quietly keeping track the whole way through. She found Narcissus resting near a still forest pool one warm afternoon, tucked into a hollow the sunlight barely reached. The water there was untouched. No deer had ever muddied it with their hooves. No shepherd had ever let a flock drink from it. It sat perfectly calm, holding a reflection as clean as any polished mirror. The trees above mirrored so precisely you could barely tell where the real forest ended and the reflected one began. Nemesis led him there deliberately, said nothing, offered no warning. She simply left him alone at the water's edge to discover on his own exactly what waited for him in that stillness. Narcissus knelt to drink. He was tired from the walk, and the water looked cool and inviting in the shade. He saw the face before his hands even touched the surface. Dark eyes, perfect features, an expression that matched his own, exactly, gazing back at him with an intensity he'd never once seen returned by anyone else. He had no way of knowing he was looking at himself. Nothing in his life had prepared him for that. All he knew was that someone finally was looking at him the way he'd never once looked at anyone. He reached down. The face reached back. Then his fingers broke the surface and it scattered into rings of light that took an agonizing few seconds to settle again. He spoke, low and urgent, and the lips in the water shaped the same words back at him, silent and perfect. For the first time in his entire life, Narcissus fell in love completely. The same overwhelming devotion he'd refused to give anyone else, handed now to something that could never once give it back. He stayed there for days, then longer than days. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't really sleep either. Just knelt at the water's edge, watching a face that watched him back with the same helpless longing he felt himself. Every time he reached for it, it broke apart into ripples. Every time he waited for the water to still again, holding his breath as though this time might somehow be different. It never was. And you have to wonder at some point whether some small part of him understood that. Whether he ever came close to recognizing his own face and simply couldn't bear to let the feeling go once he'd finally found it. The sun rose and set above him, day after day, and still he knelt there. His skin grew pale. The beauty that had once made him so cruelly certain of his own worth began fading right along with everything else he'd had. Slowly, the same way Echo had wasted away in her own grief, not far from that very same water, Narcissus wasted away too, consumed by a love with no possible way of ever being returned. When there was nothing left of him but the shape he'd once been, the gods took what remained and turned it into a flower, pale, delicate, growing exactly where he'd knelt for the last time. The Narcissus flower still grows near quiet water today, its head bent forever downward, still gazing at its own reflection the way he once did. Two people cursed in completely different ways, undone in the end by the exact same thing, a love that could never be answered. Echo, punished for words that were never really hers to give, loved a man who could only ever hear her as an echo of himself, never once as a person in her own right. Narcissus, warned from birth against knowing himself too well, fell for nothing but his own reflection, and never once realized what he was looking at, until it was already too late to matter. Thousands of years later, both of them are still with us in their own way, in every canyon that hands your own voice back to you unchanged, in every still pool that shows you your own face and nothing more. If you enjoy stories like this one, subscribe to Mythology and Legends and turn on the notification bell so the next one finds you the moment it's ready. Which myth would you like told next? Leave it in the comments below. Thank you for listening to the tale of Echo and Narcissus, and we'll see you again soon.